All right, so get ready because today we're going deep on a really heavy topic, breeding farms during slavery.
Yeah, a topic that most people don't even know existed.
Exactly. It's one of those things that's kind of whispered about but rarely discussed in detail. And
It's understandable given the sensitive nature, but I think it's crucial we understand it.
absolutely, and we're going to do that through this excerpt from a text we've got. It's a tough read, but it really exposes the horrors of these farms.
It's essential to confront this period, however unsettling it may be.
For sure, and we're approaching this with the utmost respect, aiming for a deeper understanding of this really dark period in American history.
A period that continues to have repercussions today.
Exactly. So to kind of guide our deep dive today, we're going to unpack a few key things. First, how these farms even came to be, what led to their creation.
Right, the historical context is crucial.
Then we'll get into their purpose, like what were they designed to do?
And how they fit into the larger system of slavery.
And then the mechanics of it all. Like how do they actually operate on a day-to-day basis?
Which is where it gets really disturbing.
Yeah, and we'll also discuss the just devastating impact these farms had on enslaved families.
The human cost is something we can't overlook.
And you know what else will uncover some acts of resistance from these unbelievably resilient people? Because even in the face of unimaginable cruelty, there were those who fought back.
Their stories are essential to understanding the full picture.
And one thing that really struck me as we were prepping for this deep dive was how after the international slave trade was banned,
1808, right.
yeah, they began to see enslaved women and men as like breeding stock.
It's a chilling example of how the system adapted to maintain its grip.
It really is. Like it's just bone chilling to think about.
It's dehumanization at its most extreme.
So let's rewind a bit and set the stage for how this all came about.
All right, so as you mentioned, the ban on the international slave trade in 1808, it totally changed the landscape.
Supply and demand, right?
Exactly. The demand for enslaved labor within the U.S., it's skyrocketed.
Particularly in the Deep South, I'm guessing.
You got it. Industries like cotton, sugar, and tobacco, they were booming, and they needed a constant influx of labor to fuel their growth.
And with the international slave trade shut down, they had to look inwards.
Precisely. And that's where these breeding farms come in.
But how did that happen? Like who looked at this situation and thought, yeah, let's start breeding people?
Well, it's not that simple. It was a gradual shift, a horrifying evolution of the system already in place.
So how did it actually play out?
So the Upper South states like Virginia and Maryland, they saw an opportunity in this desperate need for labor down south.
So they pivoted from exporting crops to exporting people.
In a sense, yes.
Yes.
These breeding farms, they emerged as a horrifyingly efficient way to, for lack of a better term, manufacture enslaved people to meet the demands of the Deep South.
And they didn't even try to hide it. Like the text actually uses the term breeding farms.
Which shows just how normalized this practice became.
It's like they took the principles of livestock breeding and just applied them to human beings. It's just mind-blowing.
The text really hammers home that point about dehumanization. It talks about how enslaved women were seen as nothing more than vessels for producing more enslaved people.
Yeah, it's a really tough part of the text to read. Like it describes how enslaved women were subjected to forced pregnancies.
Often through methods of coercion and violence that are just incredibly difficult to even think about.
And they had absolutely zero control over their bodies or the fates of their children.
It was a complete denial of their humanity.
It makes you sick to your stomach, honestly. Just the thought of it.
It's one of the most brutal aspects of this entire system.
The text describes scenes where children were just ripped from their mother's arms, sold off to plantations in the Deep South as soon as they were old enough to work.
It's unimaginable, the trauma of that separation.
It's hard to even fathom.
And the text, it highlights Richmond, Virginia as a major hub for this domestic slave trade.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. It was like a central market for buying and selling enslaved people.
Can you picture the scale of this operation? Thousands upon thousands of enslaved people being sold and shipped all over the South, treated like cattle.
It's just horrific.
And Richmond wasn't just some random marketplace. It was the epicenter of a system designed to profit from the suffering of Black people.
Yeah, the text goes into detail about the auction houses, the traders, even the architecture itself. It was all designed to facilitate this trade.
It's chilling to think about.
It really is. And it's a part of our history that's so often overlooked, minimized, or just straight up ignored.
We can't afford to do that any longer.
And I think that's why we're doing this deep dive.
Yeah.
We need to confront it head on. You know, we need to understand the mechanics of this system, the calculated cruelty that fueled it, and the lasting scars it's left on generations of Black Americans.
It's about understanding the roots of the problems we face today.
Exactly. And, one thing that really comes to mind is the psychological impact this system had on enslaved women.
Oh, absolutely. Forced pregnancies, the constant threat of losing their children, the denial of basic human rights. The trauma is multi-generational.
And sadly, we can still see some of those scars today.
It's a heavy truth.
It is. But it's a truth we need to grapple with if we truly want to understand the roots of systemic racism that persist to this day.
I completely agree. It's about facing our history no matter how uncomfortable it may be.
And that's what we're going to keep doing in this deep dive. We're going to delve into the devastating impact on families, the incredible resilience of those who resisted, and what it all means for us today.
It's a conversation we need to have.
Absolutely.
It's tough to even imagine what those families went through, right?
Yeah, it's just heartbreaking to think about. Like we're talking about mothers being forced to watch as their children are ripped from their arms.
It's a level of cruelty that's hard to comprehend.
And the text describes it in such vivid detail. It's like you can almost hear those mothers' screams.
And it wasn't a one-time trauma either. It was a constant threat hanging over these families every single day.
It's like living with this constant fear that your child could be taken away at any moment.
Exactly. And the text talks about how some enslaved women would try to keep their children close, hiding them in the fields or even attempting to run away together.
Just to keep their families intact.
Yeah.
It's incredible the lengths they went to.
Yeah, it really speaks to the strength of the human spirit, even in the face of such unimaginable adversity.
It makes you wonder, how did they even find the courage to keep going?
Well, I think it's important to remember that enslaved people were incredibly resourceful. They had to be.
Right, they had to find ways to survive.
Exactly. And that meant using every tool at their disposal.
So what kind of tools are we talking about?
Well, the text mentions women using traditional remedies passed down through generations.
Like what kind of remedies?
Herbs and other methods to try and prevent pregnancies.
Really? So they were actively trying to resist the system that was designed to exploit them.
Absolutely. It was a way of fighting back against the dehumanization they were subjected to.
It's almost like a silent rebellion, right?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It was a way of asserting their humanity, their right to choose, even in a situation where they had been stripped of virtually every other right.
So these women, they were essentially taking control of their own bodies in a system that was trying to deny them that control.
Exactly. And it wasn't just women who resisted. The text mentions men who refused to be used as studs, even if it meant facing brutal punishment.
Wow, so they were putting their own lives at risk just to stand up for what they believed in.
It's a testament to their courage and their unwavering sense of self-worth.
It really makes you question, how widespread was this resistance? Did it have any real impact on the operation of these breeding farms?
That's a tough question to answer. It's hard to say for sure because records from that time are often incomplete or biased.
Makes sense.
But what we do know is that acts of resistance, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, they had a profound impact on the individuals involved.
So even if they couldn't dismantle the system entirely, they were still fighting for their own dignity.
Exactly. It was about refusing to be broken, to accept their fate as simply commodities to be bred and sold.
It's amazing to think about the strength it must have taken to resist in that way.
Yeah, it's truly inspiring.
And it makes you wonder about the psychological impact of that resistance, both for the individuals and for the broader community.
Absolutely. Knowing that others were fighting back, even in subtle ways, must have been a source of hope and inspiration.
Right, it showed them that they weren't alone in their struggle.
Exactly. These acts of resistance weren't just about individual survival. They were about preserving a sense of community, of shared humanity, in the face of a system designed to crush them.
And it's those whispers of rebellion, those small acts of defiance, that help to keep the flame of hope alive, even in the darkest of times.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
And it brings us to another important question. How do we remember and teach this history?
Yeah, it's something we need to be very mindful of.
Because often we focus on the brutality, on the sheer scale of the horror.
Which is important, of course, but it's not the whole story.
Right. We need to also highlight those stories of resistance.
Absolutely. We need to understand the full spectrum of the human experience during this period. The despair, the trauma, but also the courage, the ingenuity, and the unwavering determination to resist.
It's a complex and challenging history.
It is. But it's a history that deserves to be told in all its fullness.
So if we shift our focus to the legacy of these farms, how does understanding this horrific system help us understand the issues that persist today?
Well, it's about recognizing that the mindset behind these farms, the idea that Black people were less than human, that they were property to be bought, sold, and bred, it didn't just vanish when slavery ended.
So you're saying there's a direct line from these breeding farms to the systemic racism we see today?
It's not just a line, it's woven into the very fabric of our society. We see it in the mass incarceration of Black men and women, the racial disparities in healthcare and education, the persistent wealth gap. These aren't isolated incidents. They're the echoes of a system that dehumanized and exploited Black people for centuries.
Yeah, it's unsettling to think about how that legacy continues to affect people's lives today.
And the text, it actually touches on this. It talks about how the trauma of slavery wasn't just physical or emotional, it was also spiritual. The forced separation of families, the denial of basic human rights, it created a deep-seated sense of alienation and dispossession that has been passed down through generations.
So how do we even begin to break that cycle? Like, how do we heal from this trauma?
Well, it starts with acknowledging the truth of our history. We can't sweep it under the rug or pretend it didn't happen. We have to confront it head on, learn from it, and commit to dismantling the systems that perpetuate this legacy of oppression.
So what does that look like in practice? What can we as individuals actually do to make a difference?
Well, it's about being aware of our own biases and challenging them. It's about supporting organizations that are working to dismantle systemic racism. It's about having those uncomfortable conversations with our families and friends and calling out injustice when we see it.
It sounds like a long and difficult journey.
It is, but it's a journey we have to take. The legacy of these breeding farms is a stain on our collective conscience, and it's up to us to work towards a future where everyone is treated with dignity and respect.
That's a powerful message. And I think a fitting way to wrap up this deep dive. It's been a heavy conversation, but an incredibly important one. To our listeners, we encourage you to continue learning about this history and to think critically about its impact on our present and future.
And remember the stories of resistance we discussed today. Despite the horrors they faced, enslaved people never gave up hope, and neither should we.
Well said. And on that note, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into a truly dark chapter of American history. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a more just and equitable world.